My humble respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Piran Srisankaran, Guru Piranyo, fellow Jnanis. Today I'm going to continue with this last chapter of the Katha Upanishad. I'm going to cover verse 4 from chapter, the part where, part 2, chapter 3, verse 4, which essentially is going to describe this knowledge of the Brahman and all other knowledge. So here, if you look at page 162, this verse is here. It says that if anyone is able to attain the knowledge of Brahman before death, he gets liberation in this very life. Otherwise, he's born and again in this world and other worlds. Let me describe this carefully. On one hand, we have this notion of what is born and what is not born. So here it's described that in this verse, he says that one who acquires this knowledge of Brahman, that means it's not theoretical knowledge, this experiential knowledge of this Brahman, this universal identity before death. I mean, before birth, we were that. After, when death occurs, we are that. But in between, most people are not sure. They get caught up by this. So in this Upanishad says that if you knew this Brahman during your lifetime, you transcend that, you attain that liberation. Because you are that Brahman before birth, and you are the Brahman after death. So he says that while living, if you know this Brahman, he gets liberation in this very life itself. So in this Upanishad, it says that the knower of the Brahman becomes free here and now, not after death. So he says you don't get bound by the vagaries of life, caught up by the sukha dukkha's and the oscillation between birth and death. So he says that, one who knows this, attains this Brahman, and I am Brahman. So the eternal, blissful, free from all this, cycles of life. Now, how does one attain this Brahman? It doesn't come naturally for an ordinary human being. So you have to be an extraordinary human being. What is the difference between ordinary and extraordinary? Ordinary human beings will go on with life in an ordinary way, right? They do things, they expect rewards, they do all those things, right? An extraordinary person, so most ordinary people will do it because they're expecting something, or it's their duties, and so on, right? So when things don't work out, they get upset. When things, they achieve everything, they get so overly joyed. So they're caught by the sukha and also the dukkhas. Right? So to be liberated, one needs to know the Brahman. But you cannot know the Brahman just by theoretical means or reading a book or hearing from someone. You have to experience it. To experience that, the experience takes place in the mind, human mind, nowhere else. Not in that place of worship or this place of worship. The experience takes place in the universal peace sanctuary within you. So here, he says that to attain that universal peace sanctuary, one needs to undertake a few things to reform that ordinary mind to become an extraordinary mind. That means you have the extra dimensions and extra experiences that an ordinary person, does not get. What is that? It is actually about introspection, deeply reflecting, introspect who you are, what you are, very, very deeply. Not half an hour, not 1 hour, but actually all your waking life, right? So that introspection is so important. Once you introspect, lots of questions will come, and you contemplate you have a lot of questions like Nachiketa would have, and you contemplate, and try to search the truth in these queries that you have, right? So the contemplation takes place, introspection, contemplation, and then you reflect when you were undertaking certain practices, that introspection, before introspection and contemplation, what were your mindset and what is it now? The kind of knowledge you searched before and the knowledge that you are seeking when the question appears and you're seeking deeper and deeper. And then you meditate upon what is real and unreal. So this is the practice of viveka, to know what is real and unreal. So if you don't meditate intensively, you would not know this truth, right? If you don't meditate, if you don't meditate that half an hour or an hour you allocate for yourself, you will not discover the Brahman. Not only that, if you don't live a life of meditation, right, in everything that we do, from the time we wake up to the time we go to sleep, if life itself is not, it is deep introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation, it is impossible to experience that Brahman. It becomes just a theoretical exercise, an abstract, construction, and you will not get the benefit of it. So here he says that the essence of this teaching of that Brahman is contemplation, reflection, and meditation. That's what all the great saints and sages are doing. That's what this discourse between Lord Yama and Nachiketa is making him reflect deeper. There is something far greater than our human biology, right? So the knowledge of the Brahman, the true Brahman, leads you to freedom, right? So here, even Mahan has said this very, very clearly. So one who experienced this doesn't run away from life. They learn to divinize every desires, every experiences, every relationships, right? And they see Brahman in everything. So here, uh, Lord Yama is explaining to him that, one can only, the knowledge of Brahman is what gives you liberation. The knowledge of Brahman now in this life is what leads to that liberation, right? So again, but he says those who don't acquire this knowledge, or don't put in an effort, he say before that they will be born again and then again and then again. What he's talking about here, born again and again, he's giving this, metaphor of our desires will over and over, we want this and we want that, and you'll oscillate between birth and death, you'll oscillate between sukha dukkha's. So your mind will be continuously evolving, continuously giving birth to new desires, dissolving it, it dies, and then new desires come over and over again. It never stops. So the description he gives is, most people misunderstand the born again and again. One can ask, well, Lord Yama said that the Brahman within us is not born or die. So what is real? That is, Brahman is everything. But how is it that he's saying born again and again and again? He says a mind that is infused by that Brahman, that infused by that awareness of the Brahman, realize that the Brahman is transcendental to space and time. Hence, the cycle of birth and death does not touch. The mind that is not anchored on the Brahman, the mind that is anchored on that material world that is caught up by space and time, you see that new thoughts come, new desires come, we sustain for a while, it dissolves. Another one comes up, another one comes up, over and over again. So when they explain this, when we are in the state of ignorance, every time our mind has a new thought and we are thinking, it gives us that human new personality, right? So he says that over and over again takes place, right? So he says that birth continues, that flow continues. And he says, in this world and other worlds, you see that when we have desires, oh, we want to have achieved this thing and that thing and live this way, live that way. So we start fantasizing, right? இப்படி இருக்கணும், அப்படி இருக்கணும், all these things, right? So there's a fantasy and poof, it just disappears, right? So he says that we are building, we heard this thing called we are building castles in the air. It comes from this notion we're building things that is ephemeral. It's illusion, இப்படி இருக்கணும், அப்படி இருக்கணும். We have all kinds of, and then we don't get it, we get disappointed, then we start again, over and over again. So he says this. So for me, this description of born again and again is because the mind is anchored on the material identity, and the nature of the material identity is that it generates thoughts, desires over and over again, right? So here he explains this beautifully, and most people say, how come the Upanishad says, the soul or the Brahman is not born, yet here there are descriptions. So he says that as long as the mind is anchored on that immortality, the mind becomes immortal. If the mind is anchored on that mortal desire seeking, he says that the mind will always continuously to evolve. So he says, this ignorance of this Brahman, the Ariyada Nile, the ignorance of the Brahman gives that birth over and over and over again. Until one fine day when the body drops off, you see, hey, I've been living a life of illusions. I'm actually the Brahman. So he says, for everyone, while living, one must be aware of the Brahman, live a life of Brahman, and endure, mortal experience in the Brahman itself. So he says, seek that knowledge which leads to immortality. He says, arise, awaken, and attain it. What is it saying? It's saying that we arise from this world that is superficial, transitory, continuously fleeting. It says, arise from it, awaken from it, and attain the true state of your experience. And this is what this Katha Upanishad in this passage is trying to tell us. And Lord Yama is trying to explain to Nachiketa over and over again. So then he goes on to describe the next passage, which is really important, right? In the next passage, which is passage 5, which is on page 164, right, verse 5. He says, just as a clear reflection is seen in a clear mirror, so as the self is seen in a pure mind. So think of the pure mind is not blemished by any desires or the Sukha Dukkha cycles or the birth-death cycles. Pure, absolutely pure. And is absolutely pure means it's anchored on that Brahman. It is that Brahman. He says, in the world of the ancestors, we think about our ancestors, all these things, yourself, you see, this is how my ancestors are not realizing your true essence is actually Brahman. And all the ancestors had that Brahman, right? So actually your true ancestor is the Brahman itself, right? So, but we give rise to our ancestors, from generation after generation. He says that, in that world of ancestors, you see yourself hazily. Hazy means clouded. You can't see very, very clearly, right? It's like a dream, So, as like what you see in dreams, it's not very clear, a little bit hazy and stuff like that. So, most of us who see that from our biological ancestries, we see it, in a very hazy, not very clear. He says in the world of Gandhars, what does that mean? This is the celestial beings, He says again, he says that the self, as you see, is a reflection, like in the water, right? Again, hazy. So you don't see the real thing, but you see a reflection of it, right? So he says that, as you see all this hazily in the water, he says, this when when you see the water, your reflection is not complete. And particularly if you have a lot of waves in it, again, it's very hazy. You see, so but he says that when you see yourself in the world of Brahman, you see it clearly. So it's actually the world of Brahman. So you see it as clearly as you see light and shade, very, very clear, right? So it's like seeing that Brahman, you know, in the world of Brahma, you see, but you see yourself in the world of Brahma and you see it clearly as you see light and shade, right? So here he's describing that three levels of that experience. So Brahma here is this material world, but in Brahman, you see that it is very clear. So there are four parts that he explains very, very clearly. He says that if you see your mind with the purest mind, right? You see that self in that purest self. But all other things you see, in a very hazily, not very clear, right? So that is why you see that sometimes when you see yourself in the world of Brahma, Brahma is actually our material world, the creator. You see yourself as light and shade and space and time. So this is why you see that um, when we see, in the fourth stage, when we see ourselves as a world of Brahma, Brahma is the creator. We see that the universe. So everything that resonates in us is in the form of frequency, in the form of light, and so we get that experience. But when we see ourselves in that Brahman, that is the most completest and the most purest form. So he says that the self is always the same, but the mind determines how clearly it is. So let me reiterate again. Our mind is like a mirror. If our mind is pure, right, we see the purity of that Brahman. We experience this. If we look in that second stage, we say that, look, it is, in all other stage, it is hazy, and we see a manifestation of that field that we are in, the mind that is absorbed in that field. So the mind is in the field of purity, and the Brahman, it experienced that Brahman. So again, I reflected back, the world of Brahma is actually the creator of our universe and so on. And you see all our experiences as actually the forces of, what is in the universe. So that is why you see that even when we practice meditation, when our mind is pure, we experience that purity. That state of absolute silence, that state of self, right? The state, what we say, the state of that soul in its purest form, the seamless integration of everything, that state of omnipresence, that's that universal identity, right? And last thing is liberation from that material world. And in the second one, we are caught up by our ancestries. You see, it's so hazy when you look back, it's not very clear. It's like a dream. The same thing, when we start reflecting back, in that state of, all the, celestial beings and so on, you see that it's still not very clear. But when we look at the world from that Brahma, the creator, we experience that vibration of that universe. That is why when we practice Kundalini, when we anchor on our body, we get that Brahman vibrates as a frequency. So we get that vibration uh, as that Brahman in the form of that divinity. But that's not the end. You have to go deeper to attain that true Brahman state, that state of universal identity that is transcends space and time. So this is what in this Lord Yama is explaining to Nachiketa here. So he says that the purest mind, the clearer the vision is of the self. right? So you go through that evolution. So the next one, then he goes on to verse, 6, which he explains here that, the sense organ, uh, he explains that sense organ have a separate origin, because it is that they are products of the elements, right? So because the sense organ gives us that experience of that material world, right? So we need that sense organ to cognize this material world. So he says that when our sense organ is awake, we see that the full material world is awake, right? So we interact with the material world through seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. He says that interaction of the material world happens through the mind, right? And the mind experiences this material world through all the sensory organs, right? And that sensory organs, the sense organs are the products of the elements. If you see, both all the sensory organs are made out of the five Panchabhutas to experience the five Panchabhutas, right? Your eyes, your ears, all of it are made out of the five elements in nature to experience the five elements of nature, right? So, but he says that that sensory organ is wide awake in this material world for all of us, right? He says that when it's sleeping, what happens, right? The sense organ withdraws, you know, into the source and it becomes quiet. The state of quietude happens. So the whole material world disappears. In deep sleep, even though the eyes may be open, you don't see anything. You know, in our even though in our deep sleep our ears is open, you know, we don't hear anything. The nose is functioning, yet we don't. And the same thing in all of this sensory organ, they are idle. That means it is there. The whole material world is still blasting, but nothing is registering on the mind. The mind is just quieten all the senses. It's like reducing the volume on your radio. So in deep sleep, that. So here he says that you know for a material, people in the material world, they get so caught up by the sensory things because it is the product of the material universe. So and the world of Brahma is all about the material world. So the sensory organs gives you a full experience of this material world, the space, time, continuum. In sleep, all of it goes to in the state of quietude, the silence. Right? He says that the wise people know this. He says that the self is independent of the sensory organs. So you can see here is that the deep sleep mind does not need the sensory organs to exist, right? And the same thing is that the self is needed for you to experience the material world. In both, the self is omnipresent, right? And he says so the wise one knows this, in deep sleep, you're aware the material world is not there. Still, you are aware that the material world is not there. In awakened state, you are aware the material world is awake. In both, the self is present, right? So here, that self does not identify itself as the body, mind, or the senses, the true self. And no one knows this, right? An ordinary person would not know this, right? So hence, you see that they are not troubled by the most saddest and the most challenging experience because it is of that material world. He says this is how one attains that liberation, that freedom. So he says, he who knows the self as different from the sensory organ goes beyond that sorrow. Right? So he says that the self is ever free, ever pure, ever conscious, and independent of the sensory. That's what the summary of this section is. So here, and it says that the self is transcendental to space and time. When we say transcendental to space and time, the self has no beginning, no end. So when the self, when the mind does not know this, the mind gets caught up by space, time, age, the Sukha Dukkha cycles, the birth death cycles, the worry, the continuous wanting more and more and more. So here he explains to Nachiketa that, to become transcendental to death, one needs to have a mind that is aware of the self, the mind that is with the self, the mind that is experience that self in its truest form, and the mind that is always, experiencing that self, become aware of that self in deep sleep, in deep meditation, and in that awaking state. And I always say that, when you know that the self becomes the charioteer of your journey called life, right? So, and when that happens, you see that you are riding the life, even though at times it seems that there's a lot of, uh, you know, turnings and curves and, things that you have to experience, but you're not perturbed by it. So he says that even death does not touch. So here he talks about this. So I'm going to stop here to let you reflect back. And this reflection is so important to understand this passage. I know for most of you all it may be very theoretical, but when you take the time to introspect, contemplate, reflect, and meditate, not just half an hour or 1 hour, but throughout your day, letting it percolate, you see that the mind slowly breaks away from that gravity of the materiality. The moment it breaks away from the gravity of materiality, the mind becomes one with the Brahman itself. The mind says, aha, this is the aha moment. This is the eureka moment. Aha, I am that. I am ever pure, not blemish or blemishable, right? I am free, I am liberated. I am ever conscious of who I am in deep sleep, in dream state, in awakening state, and in all states. He says, you become independent of your body and your material identity. So I'm going to stop here and then I'll let you reflect back. But I can't emphasize enough for all of you to really experience this. One needs to really practice that ICRMS, which is introspection, contemplation, reflection, meditation, in every state of your life and every moment of your life, right? Even though you're engaging, the mind is anchored on that. And you see the sense of clarity comes in. So I hope that, this passage gives you a lot more insightful and inspiration to spend time with meditation. Don't give excuses that you don't have time, You have to allocate time. And if you did this very well, everything that you do becomes, anchored on that Brahman, that the spiritual self. And you see that whatever you do will bloom. So with that, I'm going to complete today's lesson and let you reflect. We are coming to the end of this Upanishad already. Maybe another 2 or 3 more classes. We'll probably conclude and I'll give a final summary of Sandosham.